Okay, so as we talked about in the last video, if you are solving a quadratic and you only have ax squared equals a number, or if you have ax squared plus c equals a number, you can solve these by just undoing your order of operations. You don't need to learn any fancy new tricks. You're good to go. Get x all by itself, and then check it. However, if you have a b value, you can no longer just solve this by undoing the order of operations, because you're never going to be able to bring your ax squared and your x together. So this brings in our factoring. So we're going to make use of something called the zero product property. The zero product property says that if two factors multiply to 0, one of those factors must equal 0. So for example, if I had a times b is 0, well, then we either know that a has to be 0 or b has to be 0, because otherwise I couldn't end up with an answer of 0 when I'm multiplying. So this is the zero product property. If I'm multiplying two things together and the answer is 0, one of them has to be equal to 0. So a and b are going to be our factors. So we'd have a factor times a factor. So let's start with an equation that is already factored and pick up from there. So let's say we are solving the quantity of x plus 2 times the quantity of x minus 4. And it equals 0. This only works if it is equal to 0, hence it's the zero product property. So if I had the quantity of x plus 2 times the quantity of x minus 4, and the answer had to come out to be 0, then either this piece is 0 or this piece has to be 0. So think of this whole thing as a and this whole thing as b. One of them has to equal 0 for this to be true. So I'd take each factor and set it equal to 0. So either x plus 2 is 0 or x minus 4 is 0. And then I can solve them separately by undoing the order of operations. So in the equation on the left, I would end up with x is negative 2. And the equation on the right, I would end up with x is 4. So I have two answers. This original problem is equal to 0 when x is negative 2 or when x is 4. Because if I plug negative 2 back in for x, it has to go in for both x's at the same exact time. My first factor becomes 0, and my second factor is negative 6, but it doesn't even matter what the second one is. As long as the first one became 0, I now have 0 times something, so the answer has to come out to be 0. So negative 2 works. And then I could also do my check with the 4. So I plug in 4 for both x's. And the first factor is 6, but the second factor is 0. So therefore it works again, because 6 times 0 is 0. So I end up with two answers, negative 2 and positive 4. So let's try one that's not factored to start with. Let's say we had 2x squared plus x minus 3 equals 0. So in this quadratic, I have a b value because I have an x to the first power, and I have an a value because I have an x squared. So I would not be able to solve this by undoing the order of operations. So my first step would then be to factor this. So I have to come up with my a, my b, and my c. So if you feel like you have a good handle on factoring, you're going to pause the video, you're going to come up with A, B, and C, you're going to fill in your x, you're going to fill in your box, and you're going to factor 2x squared plus x minus 3. And then you can fast forward and figure out if your answer matches. Otherwise, you can keep going with us. Our A value is 2, our B value is 1, and our C value is negative 3, because we're talking about ax squared plus bx plus c. Then I would set up my factor box. The upper left-hand corner is your ax squared, so 2x squared. The lower right-hand corner is your c value, so negative 3. And then I have to use my factor x to fill in the other two boxes. So the top of your x comes from a times c, and the bottom of your x is your b value. So the top of my x is negative 6, the bottom of my x is 1. So I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to negative 6 but add to 1. So 1 and 6, 2 and 3, and one number can be negative because I'm multiplying to a negative, I'm adding to a positive, so the smaller number is the negative. So we're talking about 3 and negative 2. So then I can fill my boxes. I have a 3x and a negative 2x. Then I have to get the greatest common factor from every single column and every single row. So the GCF of 2x squared and negative 2x is 2x. And the GCF of 3x and negative 3 is 3. So it's appearing that one of my factors is 2x plus 3. And then I go sideways. The GCF of 2x squared and 3x is 1x. And the GCF of negative 2x and negative 3 is negative 1. And remember, you can double check these with your multiplying. So is 2x times x 2x squared, 3 times x, 2x times negative 1, 3 times negative 1. So those are my factors. So I couldn't solve my equation when it was in standard form, but I can rewrite it in factored form. So I have 2x plus 3 times the quantity of x minus 1 equals 0. Again, just like the previous problem, this has to equal 0 in order for me to use the zero product property. So from the very beginning, I have to make sure my equation equals 0. And now we're right where we were in our last example. It's already factored. The factor times the factor is 0. So I take both factors and set them equal to 0. And then I solve by undoing the order of operations. So one of my answers is negative 3 over 2, or negative 1/2. And the other one is positive 1. So again, I end up with two solutions. So if I put negative 3 over 2 in for both x's, I should get an answer of 0 out of that. And if I put a 1 in for both x's, I again should get an answer of 0. Okay, our last example. What happens if it doesn't equal 0 to start with? So I have a quadratic equation, but it doesn't equal 0. The only way to solve a quadratic is for it to equal 0 to start with. Must equal 0. So if you don't equal 0 in the beginning, you have to make it equal 0 by using your undoing order of operations. So I just need to move my negative 1. So I add 1 to both sides. So I am solving 6x squared minus 5x plus 1 is 0. And since I have a b value, I cannot solve this by undoing the order of operations in standard form. I've got to get this into factored form. So now would be a great time for you to pause the video, factor it, and see if you can at least get yourself to factored form. So our A is 6, our B is -5, C is 1. Set up the box. 6x squared, 1. I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to 6, but add to -5. Well, at least I'm multiplying to 6 again. I can use my list from before, but both numbers have to have the same sign now, so -2 and -3. So -2x, -3x. Then I find the greatest common factor from every single row and column. So 6x squared and -3x, their GCF is 3x. -2x and 1. We'll start with a 1 for now. 6x squared and -2x, well, that's 2x. And -3x and 1, we'll go with a 1. But then when you go back and double check with your multiplying, you realize, oh, we're missing negatives on both of the 1's. And it cleans itself up in the last box. So we are actually talking about solving 3x minus 1 times the quantity of 2x minus 1 equals 0. And it equals 0 because in the beginning we rearranged it so that it was set equal to 0. Now from here you can use your zero product property. So now would be a great time again to pause and see if you could use the zero product property without help. And then watch the video and check it. So we take each one and we set it equal to 0. So 3x minus 1 is 0, and 2x minus 1 is 0. And we solve them separately to come up with two answers. So our two answers are 1/3 and 1/2. So if I took 1/3 and plugged it in for both x's in my original equation, I should get the answer of -1. And if I took 1/2 and plugged it in for both x's, I should also get the answer of -1. So some things to keep in mind. When you're solving a quadratic that has a b value, so an x to the first power, it must equal 0. Must. Then you can factor it. Then you get to use the zero product property, set both factors equal to 0, and solve them, and you have come up with your answers. Okay, there are a bunch of problems for you to try over the next few days. They start with things that are already factored and equal to 0, and have you do the zero product property a few times. The next set of questions are quadratics with b values that equal 0. So you have to go through factoring and using the zero product property. And then the last day has questions that are not equal to 0. So you have to get it set equal to 0 first, factor it, and then use the zero product property. Best of luck to you. If you need help, make sure that you are reaching out through email or joining us in office hours. Thanks for listening and good luck.